It's the longest-serving combat aircraft in history. It has served from the jungles of Vietnam to the deserts of Iraq. It's the backbone of the U.S. Air Force's bomber squadron, yet it has never delivered the payload it was designed for. After half a century, the venerable B-52 has kept to the skies. During World War II, the bomber played two roles in air combat. One as a tactical weapon against an enemy's conventional ground forces. The other as a strategic weapon, penetrating the enemy's heartland, striking factories, airfields, and key installations. The advent of the atomic bomb made strategic air power potentially the most destructive force in human history. World War II soon gave way to the Cold War, and the U.S. faced a new enemy in a new age. Created in 1946, the mission of the U.S. Air Force's Strategic Air Command was a deterrent against the Soviet Union's growing nuclear capability. By 1960, two more weapons joined the atomic bombers as part of the United States Strategic Force: the Land-Based Intercontinental Ballistic Missile, or ICBM, and the Submarine-Launched Ballistic Missile. Together, these powerful weapons systems formed a nuclear triad, the goal of which was to deter thermonuclear war with the threat of mutually assured destruction. Today's strategic bombers evolved from the propeller-driven bombers of World War II, like the legendary B-17 Flying Fortress. After the war, more advanced propeller-driven bombers entered service, including the enormous B-36. For long-range missions, propeller-driven aircraft remained more efficient than the new jet bombers. Early jet bombers such as the B-47 simply couldn't reach targets in the Soviet Union from bases in the United States. Then, in 1952, came the Boeing B-52 Stratofortress, the first jet bomber with intercontinental range. From bases in the northern U.S., it could reach Soviet targets more than 3,000 miles away. During the Cold War, the tactics of strategic bombers would also evolve. For nearly a decade after World War II, the main threat to bombers remained the enemy interceptor. But in the mid-1950s, a new threat emerged: surface-to-air missiles. The Air Force stuck with the B-52, switching tactics instead of aircraft. Vulnerable to the new missiles, the bomber would no longer attack from high altitude. Instead, it would enter its target zone at low levels, using terrain to mask its approach from enemy radar. Complementing the new tactics were innovative weapons like the Quail decoy missile. When launched by an incoming bomber, the Quail created a false image of a B-52 on enemy radar screens. Short-range missiles such as the SRAM were also used to knock out enemy radar and missile sites before the bombers reached their target. The Vietnam War gave the Strategic Air Command another mission and offered the B-52 a new role. Instead of nuclear warheads, most B-52s were modified to carry conventional bombs. Using their cavernous bomb bays and new wing pylons, B-52s could carry up to 27.5 tons of bombs. In addition to their strategic nuclear deterrent mission, the B-52s joined the tactical air war, bombing Viet Cong positions, supply routes, and staging areas. By the end of 1972, B-52s had dropped more than 5 million tons of bombs and were credited with driving the North Vietnamese back to the negotiating table. After nearly a decade of conventional bombing missions, most of the B-52 force reverted to its original role of nuclear deterrence. Towards the end of the Vietnam War, a new strategic bomber, the B-1, was being developed to replace the aging B-52. The B-1 Lancer could fly at supersonic speeds at low altitudes to better evade Soviet defenses. Great hope was placed on the B-1, but in 1977, concerns about its cost and effectiveness led the U.S. Air Force to shelve the program. Instead, they chose to extend the life of the B-52 by modifying it to carry long-range air-launched cruise missiles called LCMs. Rather than the bomber having to run the gauntlet of Soviet anti-air munitions, the B-52 could launch a nuclear-armed missile from outside its airspace and penetrate the target zone. In the 1980s, the B-1 program was revived, and in 1986, the B-1B Lancer joined the Air Force inventory. Through stealth technology, the Lancer reduced its visibility to enemy radar, though not enough to call it a true stealth aircraft. In 1989, the first true stealth bomber, the B-2 Spirit, took to the skies. The radar-evading B-1B and B-2 were designed for the penetrator role, flying all the way to the target to deliver their weapons. More visible and vulnerable, the B-52 took on a new role as a standoff bomber, firing its missiles from hundreds of miles away from its objective. While stealth can't be added to the B-52 itself, it can be added to its payload. The B-52 is now equipped with the ACM, the Stealthy Advanced Cruise Missile. Innovations like the ACM, as well as frequent improvements to the B-52 itself, extended the life of this 1950s bomber into the 21st century. Decades after the last B-52 left the factory, it remains the most numerous bomber in the Air Force today. Of the 94 B-52s still flying, most are older than their pilots and aircrew. The B-52 has endured thanks to a continuous program of rebuilding and upgrading. Since its introduction, so many parts have been changed on each bomber that little remains of the original aircraft. Over the years, everything from the avionics to the airframe has been replaced.
B-52's been modified so many times, I don't even know if there's an original piece on the aircraft except for maybe the skin and the engines. Every time it goes in the depot, you're coming out with a new airplane, so you could fly the plane probably forever, but obviously eventually become obsolete.
Only one model of the B-52 is currently in Air Force service. Like its predecessors, the B-52H has a number of improvements over earlier models.
The H model is, of course, a series improvement on the B-52 fleet, and it's the last of the breed, if you will, the Cadillac of the force. Essentially, the largest significant difference is in the engine, which is a fan jet engine, an earlier technology, low bypass fan, but it offers improved fuel consumption, greater range. Of course, there's some improvements in the electronic countermeasures of the aircraft, some of the weapon suites, certainly the fire control system is different. If you will, it is the ultimate evolution of the series of the B-52 airplane.
The cockpit of the B-52 is reminiscent of the older bombers or jet airliners, with a massive throttle control for the aircraft's 8 engines. But over the years, the instrument panel has changed with technology. The biggest improvements have been in the aircraft's electronics, operated by the crew in the rear compartments.
My primary job is working with the radar set of the B-52. I'm also the bombardier. I'm the one who handles the weapons to make sure that they get to the proper location at the proper time. The radar navigator is responsible for operating the radar scope downstairs. He's also responsible for using 2 television cameras we have downstairs to aid us in bombing. And of course, it is a radar's major job is to get the plane to the bomb site and to drop the proper ordnance on the target.
Unlike World War II bombers, which relied on their machine guns to defend themselves, today's B-52s primarily use electronic countermeasure systems for self-protection.
I'm part of the defensive team to defend the aircraft against various threats, and that can be threats such as surface-to-air missiles or anti-aircraft artillery. To defeat those threats or to defend against them, we use various electronic equipment along with expendables such as chaff and flare systems.
Despite its advanced defensive capabilities, the greatest threat to the B-52 would prove to be the march of time. But once more, innovation would come to the plane's defense. In 2002, the B-52 celebrated its 50th anniversary. It's the longest-serving combat aircraft in the world, yet it's never been used in its original role, delivering nuclear weapons in combat. Instead, from Vietnam to Iraq, the B-52 has proven itself an invaluable conventional weapon. Shortly before the fall of the Soviet Union, the Strategic Air Command issued a report on nuclear war planning called the Phoenix Study. Citing advances in submarine-launched ballistic missiles, the study suggested that submarines and ICBMs alone could form a nuclear twin triad, with strategic bombers mainly providing backup. With less emphasis on nuclear deterrence, the B-52 evolved into a multi-role bomber. Today, the U.S. Air Force maintains a small force of B-52H bombers configured to deliver a wide range of conventional and nuclear weapons.
The concept of the manned bomber is really because it gives us a lot of flexibility and capability to operate in all spectrums of conflict. And although our primary mission here is nuclear, a B-52 can adapt very quickly to the conventional arena. That's where our training will continue to focus, is the capability to really do both missions.
A conventional bombing run requires different training and tactics from a nuclear strike.
I think probably one of the more significant differences is the number and variety of weapons that the airplane can carry in a conventional scenario. Typically, in the standard role of the B-52, we're talking about a one-pass, pinpoint, usually one weapon release, as opposed to in a conventional, multi-ships going against a target, perhaps from several different axes of attack, so as to get total coverage and destruction of the target area. That in itself is a more difficult coordination process for the air crew and for the other air crews in the other aircraft.
The B-52's value in conventional missions lies in two key traits: its heavy payload and its long range. The B-52 has a range of nearly 9,000 miles, but it can fly non-stop around the globe by means of aerial refueling. The innovation of aerial refueling led to the creation of a large fleet of tanker aircraft. The KC-135 Stratotanker entered service in 1957 and is strikingly similar to the renowned Boeing 707 jetliner. Like the B-52, the KC-135 has been in active duty for several decades, undergoing continual modification.
With the KC-135R model, we have improved the capabilities of the KC-135 aircraft by giving them bigger engines, more thrust available. It allows us to take off with more fuel than the old A model, and also we burn less fuel, so we're more efficient. We can fly farther and offload more gas.
The B-52 has a refueling receptacle on the fuselage above the cockpit. To refuel, the B-52 pilot carefully maneuvers his aircraft to a precise spot behind and below the KC-135. Then the boom operator in the tanker cautiously lowers the refueling boom. During refueling, nearly 1,000 gallons flow down the boom every minute, a ton of fuel every 20 seconds.
The challenges I face is if we have any turbulence, weather conditions that prohibit a smooth contact. I always want to get a real smooth contact with the receiver so you don't basically scratch your name in his paint or hit him in any way, windshield. You got to fly the boom around, make sure it's controlled real smoothly. You don't want to overextend to get to a receiver. You want to keep him pretty close to you, but not too close. We have 4 pumps we can turn on to use to refuel the aircraft, and it basically depends on the size of the aircraft. If it's a heavy, we can use all 4 pumps, a heavy being like a B-52, C-5, whereas a fighter, sometimes we can only use 1 or 2 of the pumps to refuel them. It takes usually 5 to 10 minutes to give them their gas.
By extending a B-52's range indefinitely, tankers have helped prolong the bomber's very existence. For over half a century, the B-52 Stratofortress has been like a chameleon, adapting to new roles and technologies through ever-changing political climates. From the Vietnam War to Operation Iraqi Freedom, the B-52 continues to serve. Ironically, a 1991 peace treaty nearly ground the bomber for good. During the Gulf War in 1991, the venerable B-52 undertook one of its most secret and arduous missions since its inception. The assignment: to destroy key Iraqi facilities using conventionally armed ELCMs and pave the way for additional strikes by short-range strike fighters. Flying round-trip from Barksdale, Louisiana to Iraq, B-52Gs traveled more than 14,000 miles non-stop for 35 hours, at the time, the longest combat mission in history. Following these missile strikes came conventional bomb attacks by B-52 units based in Europe and off the coast of Sri Lanka. Though the Air Force used precision-guided bombs for many targets, it relied on the massive payload of the B-52s to take out heavy targets, such as the sprawling chemical plant at El Cayam. As a defensive tactic, the B-52s typically flew in groups of 3 called a cell. Early in the war, missions were flown at night and at low altitude. Once the Iraqi Air Force was destroyed, high-altitude missions became possible. During Desert Storm, B-52Gs dropped more than 30% of the bombs delivered, yet it was the last combat mission of this model.
Historically, our primary mission has been nuclear deterrence, and that's where a lot of our training has been to have the capability to perform that mission if necessary. However, with the changing world conditions, the B-52 is moving more towards the conventional arena, where we can be used to diffuse world tensions as needed at any level of conventional conflict.
Soon after Desert Storm, the United States and Russia signed the Strategic Arms Reduction Treaty, a seeming death sentence for the venerable B-52. Virtually all active B-52s were ordered destroyed. Only the latest model, the B-52H, survived. The older models flew their final missions to Davis-Monthan Air Force Base in Arizona. On a field known as the Boneyard, the once proud bombers were stripped of all usable parts, then unceremoniously demolished by a 13,000-pound steel blade. The mammoth guillotine crashed down 4 times on each plane, severing the enormous wings and slicing the fuselage into 3 pieces. There, the fragments remained for 3 months, while Russian satellites confirmed they had been destroyed. In 1992, following the collapse of the Soviet Union, the Strategic Air Command was absorbed into the Air Force's Air Combat Command. In 1996, under this new command, B-52H models flew their first combat sorties in Operation Desert Strike in Iraq. There, 2 B-52Hs completed a 34-hour, 16,000-mile round trip from Guam to Iraq, breaking the record set by B-52Gs only 5 years earlier. In 2002, the fate of the B-52 changed once again. In a report called the Nuclear Posture Review, the Defense Department established a new triad. As part of this strategy, nuclear-armed B-52s will rejoin ICBMs and Trident nuclear subs to form the first offensive strike leg of the new triad. With a weapons payload of more than 70,000 pounds, the newest B-52H can carry the most diverse range of weapons of any combat aircraft. Among them, highly sophisticated conventional weapons like the Wind-Corrected Munitions Dispenser, or WICMD. First deployed by a B-52 in Afghanistan in 2002, the WICMD is a tail kit guidance system attached to a cluster bomb to adjust its direction according to wind changes. Another advanced conventional weapon it uses is the Joint Standoff Weapon, or JSOW. Entering service in 2003, it was deployed by B-52s during Operation Iraqi Freedom. Today, 94 B-52s remain in service, and the Air Force plans to keep the fleet operational through 2040. Though the new triad renews the B-52's role to deliver nuclear weapons, the Stratofortress continues to prove itself a valuable conventional bomber. Most recently during Operation Iraqi Freedom, where more than 100 missions were flown. Across the decades, the definition of strategic air power has evolved. Yet one factor has remained critical to U.S. air combat throughout the years: the B-52 Stratofortress. From the Cold War to the war on terrorism and beyond, this venerable bomber continues to fly.